Grace Chen had always believed that success in marriage, like success in business, required careful attention to detail, strategic planning, and unwavering commitment to excellence. For 8 years, she had applied these principles to her relationship with Marcus Williams, building what everyone around them considered to be the perfect modern power couple. Grace was a respected financial analyst at one of the city's most prestigious investment firms, while Marcus had climbed the ranks to become the youngest senior partner at his law firm. Together, they embodied the kind of ambitious, accomplished partnership that graced magazine covers and inspired networking events. Their penthouse apartment overlooked the city skyline, decorated with carefully curated art pieces and designer furniture that reflected their sophisticated tastes and substantial combined income. They attended charity galas, hosted dinner parties for influential friends, and maintained the kind of polished public image that opened doors and created opportunities in their respective careers. Grace took pride in their social standing and the way other couples seemed to look up to them as relationship goals worth emulating. But on Tuesday evening at exactly 7:43 p.m., as Grace sat in her home office reviewing quarterly reports for her biggest client, her perfectly constructed world began to crumble with a text message from her assistant. "Grace, are you watching Channel 7? You need to see this right now." Grace looked up from her laptop screen, confused by the urgency in her assistant's message. Channel 7 was hosting their annual live charity auction, a high-profile event that drew celebrities, politicians, and business leaders from across the region. Grace had declined to attend because she had too much work to complete before her presentation the following morning, but Marcus had gone as their representative since his law firm was one of the major sponsors. With a growing sense of unease, Grace reached for the television remote and switched to Channel 7. The charity auction was in full swing, with an energetic auctioneer encouraging bidding on luxury vacation packages and exclusive dining experiences. Grace scanned the crowd for Marcus, expecting to see him sitting at one of the prominent tables reserved for major donors. Instead, she saw him standing on the stage. Marcus Williams, her husband of 8 years, was standing in the spotlight wearing his best tuxedo and holding a microphone with the kind of confident smile that had first attracted Grace to him during their law school days. The camera focused on his face as he began to speak, and Grace felt her stomach drop as she realized what was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "I hope you'll indulge me for a moment while I take care of some very important personal business." The auction audience buzzed with excitement and curiosity, clearly delighted by the prospect of witnessing whatever surprise Marcus had planned. Grace gripped the remote control so tightly that her knuckles turned white, unable to look away from the screen but dreading what she was about to see. "8 months ago," Marcus continued, "someone very special came into my life and changed everything. She brought joy, passion, and inspiration into my world in ways I never thought possible. Tonight, in front of all of you wonderful people, I want to ask her to spend the rest of her life with me." Grace felt the world spinning around her as she processed what she was hearing. 8 months ago, Marcus was talking about meeting someone 8 months ago, someone who had changed his life and brought him joy. Grace tried to remember what had been happening in their marriage 8 months ago, searching for signs she might have missed that Marcus was developing feelings for another person. The camera panned across the audience until it found a young woman sitting at a table near the front of the room. Grace recognized her immediately. Amanda Porter, Marcus's secretary at the law firm. Amanda was 26 years old, blonde, beautiful in the conventional way that made men stop mid-conversation when she walked past. Grace had met her at several firm events and had always found her pleasant but unremarkable, someone who seemed competent at her job but not particularly ambitious or intellectually challenging. Amanda was covering her face with her hands in apparent surprise and delight as Marcus gestured for her to join him on stage. The audience erupted in applause and cheers as she made her way through the crowd, her evening gown sparkling under the stage lights. Grace watched in horrified fascination as Amanda climbed the steps to the stage where Marcus was waiting with an expression of absolute adoration. "Amanda," Marcus said, taking her hands in his as the audience fell silent with anticipation, "you've made me happier than I ever dreamed possible. Will you marry me?" He dropped to one knee and produced a ring box that he opened to reveal what appeared to be a substantial diamond engagement ring. The camera zoomed in on Amanda's tearful face as she nodded enthusiastically and said yes, her voice barely audible but clearly affirmative. The audience exploded in celebration as Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to embrace her, kissing her passionately while confetti fell from the ceiling and the orchestra played romantic music. Grace stared at the television screen in complete shock, unable to process what she had just witnessed. Her husband had publicly proposed to his secretary on live television, in front of hundreds of people and potentially thousands of viewers. He had declared his love for another woman while Grace was sitting in their shared home, working late to support their lifestyle and their future together. The television coverage continued with interviews of the newly engaged couple, both of them glowing with happiness as they described their whirlwind romance and their plans for a summer wedding. Marcus spoke about Amanda with a tenderness and enthusiasm that Grace hadn't heard in his voice for years, describing her as his soulmate and the love of his life. Amanda giggled and showed off her engagement ring while discussing her excitement about becoming Mrs. Williams. Grace reached for her phone with hands that were surprisingly steady despite the emotional earthquake she was experiencing. She opened her text messages and found Marcus's contact information, then typed a message with the same calm efficiency she applied to her most challenging professional communications. "Let's divorce." She hit send and set the phone down on her desk, then turned off the television and sat in the sudden silence of her home office. Grace felt strangely detached from the situation, as if she were observing someone else's life falling apart rather than experiencing her own personal devastation. The shock was so complete that she hadn't yet accessed the anger, hurt, or grief that would undoubtedly follow once her mind fully processed what had happened. Grace's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Marcus, but she declined it without hesitation. She wasn't ready to hear his explanations, excuses, or attempts at damage control. The public nature of his proposal had made any private conversation irrelevant. He had already communicated everything she needed to know about his feelings and priorities. Instead, Grace opened her laptop and began researching divorce attorneys, approaching the task with the same methodical attention to detail that had made her successful in her professional life. She read reviews, compared credentials, and created a spreadsheet of potential legal representation before calling the top 3 candidates to schedule consultations for the following day. Grace also began mentally cataloging their shared assets, financial accounts, and property holdings, already thinking strategically about how to protect her interests during what would undoubtedly be a complex and potentially contentious divorce proceeding. The penthouse apartment was in both their names, as were most of their investment accounts, but Grace had kept separate accounts for her personal savings and had documentation to prove her individual contributions to their shared wealth. As the initial shock began to wear off, Grace felt a strange sense of relief beneath the hurt and betrayal. For months she had been sensing that something was wrong with their marriage, noticing Marcus's distraction, his increased work hours, and his decreased interest in their relationship. She had attributed these changes to career stress, and had been planning to suggest couples counseling to help them reconnect and strengthen their partnership. Now she understood that Marcus's emotional distance hadn't been about work pressure or temporary relationship challenges. He had been falling in love with someone else, and planning a future that didn't include Grace. The public proposal had been his way of announcing not just his engagement to Amanda, but his complete abandonment of the marriage he had shared with Grace for nearly a decade. Grace's phone continued to ring throughout the evening, with calls from Marcus, concerned friends who had seen the television coverage, and family members who were trying to understand what had happened. Grace ignored all of them, focusing instead on the practical steps she needed to take to protect herself and begin the process of ending her marriage with dignity and strategic advantage. By midnight, Grace had scheduled meetings with 3 divorce attorneys, transferred money from their joint accounts into her personal savings, changed the passwords on her individual credit cards and investment accounts, and drafted a preliminary list of personal belongings she would need to retrieve from their shared home. She approached these tasks with the same professional competence that had made her one of the youngest senior analysts at her firm, treating the end of her marriage as a complex business transaction that required careful planning and execution. Grace Chen was about to discover that while building a successful marriage required collaboration and compromise, ending one effectively required only determination, intelligence, and the willingness to prioritize her own interests above emotional attachment to a relationship that had already been destroyed by betrayal. Chapter 2, the morning after. Grace woke up at 5:30 a.m., just as she had every weekday for the past 8 years, but this morning felt fundamentally different from all the others. The bed beside her was empty, which wasn't unusual since Marcus often worked late and sometimes slept in the guest room to avoid disturbing her early morning routine. But today Grace knew that Marcus hadn't come home at all, and that he likely wouldn't be coming home again. She lay in bed for exactly 5 minutes, allowing herself to fully absorb the reality of her situation before rising and beginning her morning routine. Grace had learned through years of high-pressure professional situations that emotional processing needed to be balanced with practical action, and that the best way to maintain control during a crisis was to stick to familiar routines while systematically addressing necessary changes. Grace showered, dressed in her most powerful business suit, and prepared her usual breakfast of steel-cut oats with fresh berries and green tea. As she ate, she reviewed her schedule for the day, which now included 3 divorce attorney consultations in addition to her regular client meetings and research obligations. She would need to request time off from work, something she rarely did, but this situation qualified as the kind of personal emergency that required immediate professional attention. Her phone had accumulated dozens of missed calls and text messages overnight, including several increasingly desperate attempts from Marcus to reach her. Grace scrolled through his messages, noting the progression from confusion to panic to angry demands that she call him immediately, so they could discuss the situation like adults. "Grace, please call me back," read his most recent message, sent at 2:47 a.m. "There are things you don't understand about the situation. We need to talk before you make any decisions you'll regret." Grace found it interesting that Marcus assumed she would regret her decision to divorce him, rather than regretting his decision to publicly propose to another woman while still married. His messages revealed the same self-centered perspective that had probably enabled him to justify his affair and his dramatic public betrayal. Grace deleted all of Marcus's messages without responding, and blocked his number. Whatever explanations or justifications he wanted to offer were irrelevant, now that he had made his choices so publicly and definitively. Grace was not interested in hearing about his journey of self-discovery or his newfound happiness with Amanda. She was only interested in ending their marriage as quickly and advantageously as possible.
Before leaving for work, Grace called her immediate supervisor to request a personal day, explaining that she was dealing with an urgent family matter that required legal consultation. Her supervisor, who had worked with Grace for 5 years and trusted her judgment completely, approved the request without asking for details. Grace's first divorce attorney consultation was scheduled for 9 a.m. with Margaret Foster, a partner at one of the city's most prestigious family law firms. Margaret had a reputation for representing high-net-worth individuals in complex divorce cases, and her online reviews consistently praised her strategic thinking and aggressive advocacy for her clients' interests. Margaret's office was located in a gleaming downtown tower that housed several of the city's most successful law firms. The waiting area was decorated with expensive art and fresh flowers, creating an atmosphere of prosperity and professional competence that Grace found reassuring. She wanted legal representation that matched her own standards for excellence and attention to detail. "Mrs. Williams," Margaret said, greeting Grace with a firm handshake and leading her into a spacious corner office with panoramic city views. "I understand you're dealing with a challenging situation that requires immediate legal attention." Grace had prepared for this meeting with the same thoroughness she applied to client presentations at work. She had compiled financial documents, created timelines of important events, and developed a clear narrative of her marriage and its dissolution that focused on facts rather than emotions. "My husband proposed to his secretary on live television last night," Grace began, her voice steady and professional. "I sent him a text message requesting a divorce, and I need legal representation to ensure that the process is handled efficiently and in my best interests." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly at this information, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "That's certainly an unusual set of circumstances. Can you tell me more about the timeline of your marriage and any signs that your husband was involved in an extramarital relationship?" Grace provided a comprehensive overview of her 8-year marriage to Marcus, including their financial arrangements, shared property, and the gradual changes in his behavior that she now understood had been signs of his relationship with Amanda. She was careful to present the information objectively, without dwelling on the emotional impact of Marcus's betrayal. "Do you have any evidence of the affair beyond the public proposal?" Margaret asked, taking detailed notes as Grace spoke. "I haven't looked for evidence yet," Grace replied, "but given that they've apparently been involved for 8 months, there are likely text messages, emails, credit card records, and other documentation that would support a case for adultery." Margaret nodded approvingly. "In this state, adultery can be grounds for an at-fault divorce, which could potentially affect the division of marital assets and spousal support arrangements. However, we should also consider the advantages of pursuing a no-fault divorce, which might be faster and less contentious." Grace listened carefully to Margaret's explanation of different divorce strategies, weighing the potential benefits of various approaches against her own priorities and goals. She was less interested in punishing Marcus for his infidelity than in protecting her financial interests and ending the marriage as quickly as possible. "What kind of timeline are we looking at for different types of divorce proceedings?" Grace asked, already thinking about how the process would affect her work schedule and professional obligations. "That depends on several factors, including your husband's willingness to cooperate and the complexity of your financial arrangements," Margaret replied. "Based on what you've told me about your assets and income, I would estimate anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on the level of conflict and negotiation required." Grace scheduled a follow-up meeting with Margaret and left feeling confident that she had found competent legal representation. Her second consultation was with Robert Kim, a solo practitioner who specialized in high-conflict divorce cases and had a reputation for creative legal strategies that maximized his clients' outcomes. Robert's office was smaller and less luxurious than Margaret's, but his direct communication style and detailed knowledge of divorce law impressed Grace with its practical focus. He asked pointed questions about Grace's goals for the divorce and her willingness to engage in aggressive tactics to achieve those goals. "Your husband made a significant tactical error by proposing to his girlfriend so publicly," Robert observed. "That kind of humiliation can be leveraged in negotiations, especially if he's concerned about protecting his professional reputation." Grace found Robert's strategic thinking appealing, but she was also wary of any approach that might drag out the divorce process or create unnecessary drama. She wanted to end her marriage decisively, not engage in a prolonged battle that would consume her time and emotional energy. Her third consultation was with Elena Rodriguez, a family law attorney who had built her practice around collaborative divorce processes that emphasized negotiation and compromise over litigation. Elena's approach was more conciliatory than the other attorneys Grace had met with, focusing on finding mutually acceptable solutions rather than maximizing advantages for either party. "Divorce is always difficult," Elena explained, "but it doesn't have to be destructive. Sometimes the best outcome for everyone involved is a process that allows both parties to move forward with dignity and financial security." Grace appreciated Elena's perspective, but she wasn't sure that Marcus deserved consideration for his dignity after his public betrayal. However, she recognized that a collaborative approach might be more efficient and less emotionally taxing than a contested divorce. After completing her consultations, Grace spent the afternoon reviewing her notes and comparing the different attorneys' approaches to her situation. Each of them had offered valuable insights and different strategic perspectives, but Grace needed to choose representation that aligned with her priorities and personality. Margaret Foster's prestigious firm and aggressive advocacy appealed to Grace's competitive instincts and desire for the best possible outcome. Robert Kim's creative strategies and willingness to use Marcus's public humiliation as leverage offered the potential for significant tactical advantages. Elena Rodriguez's collaborative approach promised a faster, less contentious process that would allow Grace to focus on rebuilding her life rather than fighting over the remnants of her marriage. By evening, Grace had made her decision. She called Margaret Foster's office and scheduled a retainer meeting for the following day, choosing the combination of prestige, experience, and strategic thinking that best matched her own professional standards. Grace also used the afternoon to begin the practical work of separating her life from Marcus's. She opened new bank accounts at a different financial institution, transferred her individual assets out of their shared investment funds, and changed her emergency contacts at work to reflect her single status. Most importantly, Grace began the emotional work of processing the end of her marriage. She allowed herself to feel the hurt, anger, and disappointment that she had set aside in order to handle the immediate practical necessities. The tears came finally, along with the recognition that she was grieving not just the loss of her husband, but the loss of the future she had imagined they would build together. But even in her grief, Grace felt a growing sense of liberation. For the first time in years, she could make decisions based entirely on her own needs and desires, without having to consider Marcus's preferences or accommodate his schedule. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also freed her from a relationship that had apparently been unfulfilling for both of them. Grace Chen was ready to begin the next chapter of her life, and she was determined to make it better than anything she had experienced during her marriage to a man who had never valued her enough to end their relationship honestly before pursuing someone else.
Chapter 3: Strategic Moves. Within a week of Marcus's public proposal, Grace had transformed her approach to the situation from reactive damage control to proactive strategic planning. She attacked the dissolution of her marriage with the same analytical rigor and attention to detail that had made her one of the most successful financial analysts in her firm, treating every decision as part of a comprehensive campaign to maximize her advantages and minimize her losses. Margaret Foster had been worth every dollar of her substantial retainer fee. During their second meeting, she had outlined a strategy that would position Grace for the most favorable possible outcome while protecting her professional reputation and personal dignity. Margaret's investigative team had already uncovered a wealth of evidence documenting Marcus's affair with Amanda, including hotel receipts, restaurant charges, and text message records that painted a clear picture of an ongoing relationship that had been carefully hidden from Grace. "Your husband was not particularly discreet," Margaret observed, reviewing the investigation report with Grace. "He used his personal credit card for most of his expenditures related to the affair, and he apparently didn't consider that those records could be subpoenaed during divorce proceedings." Grace felt a grim satisfaction at Marcus's carelessness, though she was also hurt by the evidence of how extensively he had been deceiving her. The timeline revealed that their relationship had begun exactly as Marcus had stated during his proposal speech, 8 months earlier, coinciding with a period when Grace had been working long hours on a major client project and had assumed Marcus was equally busy with his own professional obligations. The financial investigation had also revealed information that Grace found both surprising and strategically useful. Marcus had been using their joint credit cards to pay for expensive gifts for Amanda, including jewelry, vacation trips, and designer clothing that totaled more than $30,000 over the course of their relationship. He had also been paying for Amanda's rent and car payments, effectively using marital assets to support his girlfriend while maintaining his marriage to Grace. "This level of financial misconduct gives us significant leverage in negotiations," Margaret explained. "Your husband has essentially been stealing from the marriage to fund his affair, which could affect the court's determination of property division and spousal support." Grace authorized Margaret to begin formal divorce proceedings, including a comprehensive audit of all marital assets and a detailed accounting of Marcus's financial misconduct. She also approved an aggressive timeline that would expedite the process and minimize the period of uncertainty in negotiation. Meanwhile, Grace was dealing with the personal and professional fallout from Marcus's very public betrayal. The charity auction had been covered by multiple local news outlets, and the dramatic proposal had gone viral on social media platforms where users were sharing clips of the romantic moment without understanding the context of Marcus's existing marriage. Grace's colleagues at work had been supportive but curious, offering assistance while clearly wanting details about the scandal that everyone was discussing in whispered conversations. Grace maintained her professional composure and declined to provide any information beyond confirming that she and Marcus were pursuing divorce proceedings. "I appreciate everyone's concern," Grace told her immediate team during their weekly meeting, "but I'm handling my personal situation through appropriate legal channels, and I prefer to keep my focus on our professional obligations." Grace's supervisor had been particularly understanding, offering her additional flexibility with her schedule and workload during what was obviously a challenging personal period. Grace accepted the support gratefully, but insisted on maintaining her full client responsibilities, recognizing that professional success would be even more important now that she would be financially independent. The most difficult aspect of the situation was dealing with family and friends who had been shocked by the sudden end of what they had perceived as a successful marriage. Grace's parents had flown in from California to provide emotional support, and her sister had offered to help with practical tasks like apartment hunting and moving arrangements. "I never liked Marcus anyway," Grace's sister confided during one of their planning sessions. "He always seemed too impressed with himself, and he never treated you like you were as accomplished as he was." Grace was surprised by this perspective, realizing that her family had been observing problems in her marriage that she hadn't recognized or had chosen to ignore. Looking back with the clarity that betrayal provides, Grace could see that Marcus had indeed been dismissive of her career achievements and had often minimized her contributions to their shared success. "I think I was so focused on maintaining the appearance of a perfect relationship that I stopped paying attention to whether I was actually happy," Grace admitted to her sister. "Marcus and I looked good on paper, and we functioned well as a professional team, but we hadn't been emotionally connected for a long time." This recognition was both painful and liberating. Grace began to understand that the end of her marriage, while traumatic in its execution, might actually be an opportunity to build a more authentic and fulfilling life than the one she had been maintaining with Marcus. Grace also had to address the practical matter of their shared living situation. Marcus had been staying at Amanda's apartment since the night of his proposal, but their penthouse was still legally his residence, and most of his belongings remained there. Grace wanted him to remove his possessions as quickly as possible so she could begin the process of making the space feel like her own. Margaret handled this negotiation through Marcus's attorney, establishing a schedule for him to collect his belongings under supervised conditions that would prevent any potential confrontations or attempts at manipulation. Grace would not be present during these visits, eliminating any opportunity for Marcus to appeal to her emotions or try to influence her decisions about the divorce. "Your husband has been asking his attorney to arrange a private meeting with you," Margaret reported during one of their regular updates. "He apparently wants to explain his actions and discuss the possibility of a more amicable resolution to your divorce." Grace declined this request without hesitation. She had no interest in hearing Marcus's explanations or justifications for his behavior, and she certainly wasn't interested in making the divorce process more comfortable for him. He had chosen to end their marriage in the most public and humiliating way possible, and he would have to live with the consequences of that choice. Instead, Grace focused on the positive aspects of her changing circumstances. She was sleeping better than she had in months, no longer subconsciously anxious about Marcus's moods or schedule. She was eating more regularly and enjoying food again, rather than grabbing quick meals between work obligations and social commitments. Most significantly, she was rediscovering interests and activities that she had abandoned during her marriage in favor of the couple's focused lifestyle that Marcus had preferred. Grace signed up for a photography class that met on weekends, something she had wanted to do for years but had never pursued because Marcus preferred to spend their free time networking at professional events or attending social gatherings that might benefit their careers. She also joined a women's investment club that focused on financial independence and entrepreneurship, connecting with other ambitious women who were building wealth and careers outside of traditional marriage structures. "It's interesting how much more time you have when you're not managing someone else's schedule and emotions," Grace observed to her sister during one of their regular phone calls. "I had no idea how much energy I was spending on maintaining our relationship and our shared image." Grace was also discovering that her professional reputation had not been damaged by the scandal and might actually have been enhanced by her calm and dignified response to Marcus's betrayal. Several clients had expressed admiration for her grace under pressure, and her supervisor had hinted that her handling of the situation demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and composure that the firm valued in its senior leadership. "Crisis reveals character," her mentor at the firm observed during one of their monthly meetings. "Your response to this difficult situation has shown everyone that you have the emotional intelligence and strategic thinking to handle whatever challenges come your way." Grace felt proud of this assessment, recognizing that she had chosen to respond to Marcus's betrayal in a way that reflected her values and priorities rather than simply reacting emotionally to the hurt and humiliation he had caused. As the divorce proceedings moved forward according to Margaret's strategic timeline, Grace began to envision a future that was entirely her own creation. She would have financial independence, professional autonomy, and the freedom to build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than social expectations or career advantages. Marcus Williams had unwittingly given Grace the greatest gift of her adult life, the opportunity to discover who she was and what she wanted when she wasn't trying to be half of a perfect couple. Chapter 4: Unexpected Revelations. 3 weeks after Marcus's public proposal, Grace received a phone call that would transform her understanding of her marriage and her husband's betrayal. The call came from Jessica Martinez, Amanda Porter's roommate, who had obtained Grace's contact information through a mutual acquaintance and was requesting a private meeting to discuss information that might be relevant to Grace's divorce proceedings. I know this is unusual, Jessica said during their brief phone conversation, but there are things about Marcus and Amanda's relationship that you should know, things that might affect your legal situation. Grace was initially skeptical about meeting with someone connected to Amanda, suspecting that this might be an attempt by Marcus or his girlfriend to manipulate her or gather information about her divorce strategy. However, Margaret Foster advised that they should at least hear what Jessica had to say, particularly if she was offering information that could strengthen Grace's position in negotiations. They arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where Grace could maintain control over the conversation and leave immediately if Jessica's intentions proved to be problematic. Grace arrived early and chose a corner table where she could observe the entrance and ensure their conversation would remain private. Jessica turned out to be a serious young woman in her late 20s who worked as a paralegal at a different law firm than Marcus's. She approached Grace with obvious nervousness but also determination, carrying a folder that appeared to contain documents or photographs. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Jessica began, settling into the chair across from Grace. "I've been debating whether to contact you for weeks, but I finally decided that you deserve to know the truth about what's been happening." Grace studied Jessica's expression, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. "What kind of truth are you referring to?" Jessica opened her folder and removed several printed emails and text message screenshots. "Amanda has been planning this whole thing for almost a year. She didn't just happen to fall in love with Marcus. She researched his marriage, his career, his financial situation, and she deliberately set out to become his secretary so she could seduce him and break up your marriage." Grace felt her breath catch as she processed this information. "Are you saying that Amanda specifically targeted Marcus because he was married to me?" "Not specifically because he was married to you," Jessica clarified, spreading the documents across the table. "Because he was married to someone successful and wealthy, and because his law firm represents high-profile clients that Amanda thought could advance her own ambitions. She saw Marcus as a stepping stone to a better life, and your marriage was just an obstacle she needed to remove." Jessica showed Grace printed emails that Amanda had sent to a friend describing her strategy for attracting Marcus's attention and gradually undermining his relationship with Grace. The emails were calculating and manipulative, outlining specific tactics for making Marcus feel underappreciated at home while positioning herself as someone who truly understood and supported his ambitions. "She studied your social media accounts and your public appearances together," Jessica continued, showing Grace additional evidence. "She learned about your interests, your schedule, your relationship dynamics, and she used that information to present herself as everything she thought Marcus felt was missing from his marriage." Grace read through the emails with growing amazement at the sophistication of Amanda's manipulation. Amanda had researched Grace's career demands and used that information to suggest activities and experiences that would appeal to Marcus during periods when Grace was busy with work projects. She had also carefully observed Grace's interaction style with Marcus and had deliberately adopted a more deferential and admiring approach that contrasted with Grace's equal partnership dynamic. "Why are you showing me this?" Grace asked, though she was already beginning to understand the implications of Amanda's deception. "Because Amanda has been bragging about her success and she's already planning her next move," Jessica replied. "She never intended for Marcus to be her final destination. She's using his connections and reputation to network with his wealthy clients and colleagues, and she's already identified several potential targets for her next relationship upgrade." Jessica produced additional evidence, including text messages where Amanda discussed her plans for leveraging her engagement to Marcus into introductions with more influential and wealthier men. Amanda had apparently viewed the public proposal not as a romantic commitment, but as a publicity stunt that would establish her as someone worthy of attention from the social elite. "She's also been lying to Marcus about her background and qualifications," Jessica added. "Her resume contains false information about her education and previous work experience, and she's been using fake references to secure positions at prestigious firms." Grace felt a complex mixture of vindication and disgust as she absorbed this information. On one hand, learning about Amanda's calculated manipulation confirmed that the end of her marriage wasn't the result of any failure on Grace's part or any genuine incompatibility between her and Marcus. On the other hand, the revelation that Marcus had been so easily manipulated by someone with such obvious ulterior motives reflected poorly on his judgment and character. "Do you have documentation of the false resume information?" Grace asked, recognizing the potential legal implications of Amanda's fraudulent employment practices. Jessica nodded and provided copies of Amanda's actual educational transcripts alongside the inflated credentials she had used to secure her position at Marcus's law firm. The discrepancies were significant enough to constitute employment fraud, which could potentially affect Marcus's own professional standing if his firm discovered that he had been involved with someone who had lied about her qualifications. Grace thanked Jessica for the information and promised to protect her identity if any of the evidence became part of legal proceedings. She immediately called Margaret Foster to arrange an emergency meeting to discuss how this new information might affect their divorce strategy. "This changes everything," Margaret said after reviewing the evidence Jessica had provided. "If your husband was manipulated by someone who was deliberately targeting him for financial and social gain, it could significantly affect the court's view of his actions and their impact on your marriage."
Margaret explained that Amanda's calculated manipulation could be used to argue that Marcus had been the victim of fraud rather than simply an unfaithful husband, which might make him more sympathetic to both the court and potential negotiation partners. However, the evidence also revealed that Marcus had been remarkably naive and poor judgment in allowing himself to be manipulated so thoroughly. "How do you want to use this information?" Margaret asked. "We could present it as evidence that your husband was defrauded, which might make him more cooperative in divorce negotiations, or we could use it to demonstrate his poor judgment and vulnerability to manipulation, which might support arguments for a larger share of marital assets." Grace considered both approaches, weighing the strategic advantages against her own emotional responses to the situation. Learning about Amanda's manipulation had actually made Grace feel somewhat sympathetic toward Marcus, recognizing that he had been deceived as thoroughly as she had been, albeit in a different way. "I want to focus on ending the marriage quickly and fairly," Grace decided. "If this information makes Marcus more cooperative and reasonable in negotiations, that serves my interest better than using it to embarrass him further." Margaret agreed to incorporate the new evidence into their negotiation strategy, using it to encourage Marcus's cooperation rather than as ammunition for more aggressive tactics. The revelation of Amanda's manipulation provided Grace with significant leverage, but it also offered the possibility of resolving their divorce more amicably than had seemed possible immediately after Marcus's public betrayal. Grace left Margaret's office feeling more confident about her divorce proceedings, but also more thoughtful about the complexities of her marriage and its dissolution. Marcus had behaved badly, but he had also been manipulated by someone who was far more calculating and deceptive than either of them had realized. The situation reminded Grace of her grandmother's advice about the importance of understanding people's motivations and character before trusting them with important decisions. Marcus had failed that test spectacularly, allowing his ego and emotions to override his judgment in ways that had devastated multiple people's lives, but Grace was beginning to understand that her marriage had probably been doomed regardless of Amanda's interference. The fact that Marcus could be so easily manipulated by someone appealing to his ego and offering uncritical admiration suggested fundamental problems with his character and their relationship that would have emerged eventually in some other form. Grace felt grateful for Jessica's courage in coming forward with the truth, but she also felt relieved that she would never have to deal with Marcus's poor judgment and vulnerability to manipulation again. Whatever happened in their divorce proceedings, Grace was confident that her future relationships would be built on much stronger foundations of mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine compatibility. Chapter 5. Resolution and New Beginnings. The revelation of Amanda's manipulation had a dramatic effect on the divorce negotiations, transforming what had appeared to be a potentially contentious and prolonged legal battle into a relatively straightforward settlement process. When Margaret Foster presented the evidence of Amanda's calculated deception to Marcus's attorney, Marcus's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by anger, and finally by what appeared to be genuine remorse for the pain his poor judgment had caused Grace. Marcus requested a meeting with Grace through their attorneys, not to attempt reconciliation, but to offer a formal apology and to discuss how they could resolve their divorce with dignity and fairness. Grace agreed to this meeting, curious to see how Marcus would respond to learning the truth about Amanda's motivations and his own gullibility. The meeting took place in Margaret Foster's conference room, with both attorneys present to ensure that the conversation remained productive and legally appropriate. Marcus looked older than Grace remembered, with stress lines around his eyes and a subdued demeanor that was very different from his usual confident presentation. "Grace," Marcus began, his voice quiet and sincere, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond anything I can adequately express.
I was selfish, deluded, and incredibly cruel in how I handled our marriage and its ending. Learning about Amanda's manipulation doesn't excuse my behavior, but it has helped me understand how completely I lost sight of my values,